Our conversation tonight is with two giants in the field of Jefferson studies and American history, Professors Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf. We are grateful and honored to have you both here. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard University. A graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School, Professor Gordon-Reed is the author or co-author of 6 books, and in 2009, she won the Pulitzer Prize in History, the National Book Award, and 15 other prizes for her book titled The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, which presents a portrait of slavery through the eyes of enslaved people. That work was a follow-on to her enormously influential first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, published by the University Press of Virginia. During her career, she has won highly prestigious fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the New York Public Library. In 2010, she was awarded the National Humanities Medal, and a year later was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her most recent work, available for sale on the table here, is co-authored with Professor Peter Onuf and is entitled Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. Let me now turn to her co-author, Peter Onuf, who is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Virginia. He earned his undergraduate and doctoral degrees from Johns Hopkins University, and during a distinguished career, he authored or co-authored 14 volumes, including an edited volume in 1999, on what was then called the Sally Hemings Controversy. He is most recently the author of The Mind of Thomas Jefferson, and he is working on a book titled Jefferson and the Virginians, Democracy, Constitutions, and Empire, forthcoming from Louisiana State University Press. You may also know Professor Onuf as the host emeritus of a wonderful public radio show, now podcast, called Backstory, which explores history in thoughtful and entertaining ways. This summer, Professors Gordon-Reed and Onuf will be continuing their collaboration by leading an interdisciplinary summer workshop for scholars at Stanford University on the constitutional history of Anglo-American empire. As I hope you can see, our guests tonight have spent many years researching, thinking, writing, and teaching about Thomas Jefferson's ideas, about Thomas Jefferson the man, and the world he lived in. Their scholarship is seminal, even monumental in the field. And with that, I'd like to welcome them to the stage and to begin our conversation. It is customary for our conversation series to launch with a question for our two distinguished guests, and then they can take the ball and run with it. So let's open with a question about what might be called the paradox of Thomas Jefferson. Here's a man who is a conspicuous Democrat, small d, who helped found the American Republic. Yet he lives with great privilege as a slave-owning aristocrat. How can we reconcile these two Jeffersons?
Well, okay.
We're speechless.
We're speechless. Well,
Bad question, Brad.
I think the first thing that I would say, and then I'll turn it over to Peter, is that it seems problematic for us in our day and age, but it would not have been problematic for him, for his time. I think he understood the problem of slavery, and he understood that there was something of a paradox, but it is not the same problem for him, or would not have been the same problem for him as it is for us.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's important to talk about Jefferson, race, and slavery because that's what we're obsessed about when we think Jefferson. The word that we want to banish from the language with regard to Jefferson is hypocrisy, because we all know, and this is going to be on video. This is the Declaration of Independence. It's not the original. And Jefferson tells us there that all men are created equal. Then we say, how could you possibly own human beings if you believe in natural rights, you believe in equality? And the answer we'd like to suggest, and we'll talk about this for a few minutes, is that democracy depends on boundaries. We have to know, who are we talking about? Who is the people, or who are the people? And that's a question that American revolutionaries had to answer. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is doing. It's defining a people and claiming respect and recognition from other peoples or nations or powers of the earth. So it's that relationship of a whole people, but it's a newly defined whole people, because everybody who lived in the British Western Hemisphere, that's the 26 to 30 colonies, historians disagree about things like this, only 13 of those colonies were involved in this experiment in Republican government. And even in those 13 colonies, a large number of people didn't sign on. And a large number of people, say 20%, weren't asked to sign on. That's a very clever reference to enslaved people. John Adams would tell you about the rest of the population, that 1/3 of them were loyalists. That's probably an exaggeration. The estimate that gets most traction these days is 20%. And perhaps 1/3 were dyed-in-the-wool patriots, at least most of the time. And a lot of people were fair-weather friends. So who is the people? That's a big question. And one of the things the revolution does is force people to answer that question. The boundaries of community, of the democracy, if you will, or the language that Jefferson would be comfortable with, the republic. Those are the boundaries that race and slavery are very important to that definition.
Yes, and it's clear that African American enslaved people were not part of the people, the polity that was being created. So that slavery was a problem that had to be solved in some way, but the immediate problem that they're solving after the mobilization for revolution and after the creation of the United States, of the Union, that's a political question, and thinking about who the people are is one thing. Solving the problem of slavery is something that he felt or believed would have to come in time. And that's why when he's thinking about the Declaration, now later on, there is a sense that the Declaration begins to mean something more. Obviously, it's not just about the sort of the preamble, the universal language about all men are created equal, takes on a life of its own, even during his lifetime. But at the beginning of this, he's clearly thinking about the people in terms of the European Americans who were there and who made the revolution and who were going to have the benefits of the Union and eventually the country and the nation that was created. So this is tough for us because we're here and we know what happened, right? We know about the struggle, we know the Civil War, we know the Civil War amendments, and it's tough for us to think about a time when the founders or people like Jefferson are forming a country with an idea that African American people aren't going to be a part of it. They can't be a part of it. They were brought here as enslaved people. They had to found their own country, have their own freedom in their own place. Native Americans could join in. If they didn't, they would be essentially annihilated. They would be lost, either that they would become a part of the white nation and become white. So these are the questions that are very, to us, are problematic because we have made a commitment on paper and, well, more than on paper. No, more than on paper. We've made a commitment to a diverse culture, a multiracial culture, a multicultural place, and that's not what he was doing at the time because he couldn't see that. He was a visionary in lots of ways, but he could not see the kind of nation that we hope for ourselves today.
You mentioned sending enslaved people elsewhere. Jefferson did believe that slavery was an injustice. He's consistent in that regard. He does believe that enslaved people do have natural rights, but those rights cannot mean anything until you rise into civil society. So they are, you might say, latent or potential rights. Because obviously, if you looked around the world in Jefferson's day, you wouldn't find a lot of free people. You wouldn't find people who were enjoying anything like the rights that Anglo-Americans were claiming for themselves. And he had an idea, however, that that claim that we're making for ourselves is one that we could make for our enslaved people. And for me, one of the most disturbing passages of Query 14 of his only book, The Notes in the State of Virginia, is when he says, and this is his solution, I think many of you know about this, but if not, it's important to keep in mind when we talk about the larger problem of democracy, the solution is this: we will emancipate or enslaved people, that in the fullness of time, and that time extends further and further into the future as Jefferson gets older, but in the fullness of time, we will emancipate, and then we will expatriate. And we will, and this is the passage that disturbs, we will declare them a free and independent people. It's as if moving the other way across the Atlantic to West Africa, then they cross the threshold into history. They get to be a people. And that's what he imagines, a world in which all peoples, all nations determine their own destiny, including enslaved people once they have become free.
They become an independent nation, then they could meet on some terms of equality with other nations. And that is something that's just very difficult for us to take because, as I said, with the commitments that we've made, but for him and other members of the founding generation, Madison, Monroe, Marshall, all of those people, that was the quote-unquote liberal solution: emancipation and expatriation, and interesting enough, to declare them. The other thing that's disturbing about them is that after he is, of course, the famous author of the Declaration of American Independence. Part of the mobilization for Americans was to get together and to declare themselves, to make that declaration. And two of my colleagues got into a Twitter battle about this. Joyce Chaplin and wait a minute, let me pull back from this. Ted Cruz is not my colleague. He was, the connection that we have is that we both went to Harvard Law School. So it was Harvard Law versus Harvard History on the question of when America became a country. Was it when we made the Declaration, or was it when other nations accepted this declaration? Of Joyce, being the historian, says it's when other nations accepted it. Ted Cruz says it's when we made the Declaration and when we won. When we basically won the war, that's when we are American. So the point of all of this is that these are people who are at this time are thinking about creating this country, who the people are, who's in and who's out, and there's no place for blacks in that democracy. So we think about democracy and its discontents. You have to think about who these people are and how do you constitute a country that is not, that's supposedly supposed to be about an idea, but actually from the very, very beginning has a very, very strong sense of the importance of race.
And that question of who the people are, of course, is a live one with us today. Some people claim preemptively on their own behalf that they're the real Americans or the great Americans or the huge Americans or whatever.
The huge Americans?
That was really
Who's
very
the huge
clever.
Americans?
Well, as we fashion ourselves with groups of troubled, neurotic people such as yourselves as therapists, and we want you to feel better about Jefferson and therefore about yourselves. I don't know that we've gotten very far by talking about his attitudes toward the future of slavery and enslaved people. It's a hard one to swallow. Let's just say that from his perspective, according to his moral vision, and I emphasize that there is a morality to it, he believes justice can be done to enslaved people. So let's at least hold that in your mind. I know it's not satisfactory and you're still very troubled. I can tell I can't actually see much given the blinding light, but I just know
You can feel it.
you're suffering out there. Let's at least put that to one side and talk about the claims that Jefferson is a Democrat or is the icon of democracy. And given Brad's provocative introduction where he calls him an aristocrat, we're on the horns of a dilemma. Those terms seem to be antithetical. Certainly where we started was the idea to be a slave owner and to think about race in the ways that Jefferson did preemptively disqualifies him as a Democrat according to our judgment today. But let's see if we can dig a little bit deeper on the idea of Jefferson as a Democrat. And let me just throw this at you, Annette. She loves this when I put her on the spot. How can this, well, we'll see. This may be the last time we ever perform together. How can this man who has such, well, I'll just get personal for a minute. I have trouble walking around Monticello because of all the things that Jefferson accumulated as our first great national commodity fetishist and shopper.
Shopper.
Yeah, shopper is the technical term. And a person who lived very well, who knew about French wines and French cooking and trained his slave, James Hemings, to bring French cuisine to the Virginia Piedmont, which is a brave and bold thing to do. If there's anybody in Anglo-America on the eve of the American Revolution who seems to rise to the level of a European-style aristocrat, it's Thomas Jefferson. So what has that Thomas Jefferson got to do with the people? And we've started by talking about the people as all those people are mobilizing on behalf of the revolution. So that's the beginning. Where do we go from there?
Well, we can start, where do we go from there? We can think about how he began as a person who was dissatisfied with his home, Virginia, dissatisfied with his class. Jefferson could be considered a class traitor. He was called a class traitor. They didn't say class, they didn't use that term, but that's what it was meant, that he turned against his own people in a way in favor of looking towards ordinary farmers, ordinary white people as the future. And this dissatisfaction with the Virginia gentry that he shows in his writings about the legislature, all the things that they're not doing. This is someone I really think lived, certainly at the beginning of his life, well, most of his life, lived through books, influenced by what he read and a vision of the future. And the people around him, the people in his class just weren't cutting it for him. And so the people he could rely on, it wouldn't be enslaved people, obviously, they're out of the picture. It would have to be ordinary Virginians whom he thought, if trained well, could be, again, this is another anachronistic term, but a vanguard in a way, that these are the people who are going to do well and make Virginia surpass even New England, the places that where he was, the region that he most envied, and the kinds of things that they were doing. Virginia was behind compared to that. So I think it's dissatisfaction with his class, the vision of a future that was different, that was, remove monarchy and all of the things that flow from that, and have a Republican society made up of ordinary people, ordinary white guys who are going to make the American nation.
Help me, though. Thinking of history tourists who go to the shrines of the founders in Virginia, they have an image of Virginia as, they're embarrassed now about slavery, but they have an image of Virginia as the place that was the hearth or the incubator of presidents, of statesmen, of the great revolutionaries. Now, why would Jefferson, among all those founders, have a distaste for, well, his own class, his own people, for himself? Is he self-loathing?
I don't think he was self-loathing. But I'm pretty sure he was not self-loathing. He seemed pretty satisfied with himself, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Quite satisfied with himself. But the people around him just were not. Virginia was backwards. And he saw it as backwards. I mean, the Virginia Constitution, the kinds of things that he wanted, the hopes that he had for the future, they just weren't fulfilling, and there had to be a new dispensation with a different group of people. Do you think that he was self-loathing?
No, I think you were right, and I don't know why, that was a stupid question. I was just trying to bait her, and because we're doing the therapy talk now, I thought self-loathing would be a useful hook to get into it. Well, what I'm getting at, though, with Jefferson is, and I think you started the discussion well with this idea, that he, in effect, reads himself out of Virginia. And you might even say in his notes on Virginia, he writes Virginia in his mind. His fantasy of what Virginia could be is that book I talked about. And those are maybe the two crucial things. The distaste he has for Virginia, partly because it's a backwater place. It is no place. And one thing we have trouble imagining today, because we're so full of America, and America is so full of itself, but its moment is over, because remember, the 20th century was the American century. We won't talk about the 21st. But Virginia was a backwater. What mattered for somebody like Jefferson, who was an ambitious intellectual, a reader, was to get closer to the big world. The big world was across the ocean.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And he knew that it was a better world out there, and he looked, and certainly with his many interests as an architect, he could certainly look and see what was going on in Williamsburg when he goes off to college there, and he basically trashes the place, the architecture, and says, look at this. This is nowhere. This is nothing. And he knows that there's a bigger world out there, that he wants to be a part of it. I think that's the interesting thing, because we haven't answered this question, and there's really no way to answer this, because this is a totally internal thing. What makes a person think that they're going to be a leader in the world, that they're going to do something in the world? And all of the things that he took on, that's a personality kind of thing. It's almost a megalomania when you sort of think about all of the things that he's involved in. Where does that come from? And there's no real set answer to it. I mean, Madison was an ambitious person as well. There are other ambitious people. Hamilton was ambitious, but in a different kind of way, in a certain kind of way. It's almost ineffable in a sense, that this notion that he's going to have a place in the world.
Yeah, and you might say that the way he thinks about the American people, and it's based, as you're suggesting, on images he has of the virtuous farmers, the people we call yeoman farmers now, with their self-sufficient household economy and so forth. He envies the life that's playing out in Pennsylvania. You mentioned New England before. It's as if he's repopulating Virginia, the Virginia he actually lives in, with these idealized people. So to some extent, his comfort with the people is because he's constructed them in his own mind. He has an idea about who they are, or maybe better, who they might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a part of this vision thing. Public education, political participation, ward republics, this idea of having small units so that giving everybody a chance to participate in government. And he has great hopes for them. It really is a sort of vision of who these people are, rather than who they can be, other than who they actually are. Yeah.
Right. And that idea of the people he has also, and getting back to your megalomania point, I love it that you're playing along with my therapeutic talk here. That's a big bad disease, so I hope there are no megalomaniacs out there, because you should see somebody if you are. That megalomania, his idea of the people really provides you might say, a platform, a stage on which he can imagine himself as a new kind of leader. The last kind of leader Jefferson would want to be would be a king. Because the existence of the landed aristocracy, that is an aristocracy of privilege based on the law and the descent of great families and of the ruling dynasties, that's the world you have to destroy. That's the old regime. Clear it off. And what are you left with? You're left with, well, the people. And then that is the great opportunity.
And he's doing everything the opposite of it. When he becomes president, he wants to get rid of the trappings of monarchy. He's critical of Washington because he has the Coach and Four and the seal and all those kinds of things that are sort of vestiges of monarchy. So he wants to do something completely different and model a different type of leadership, getting sworn in with no sword. The presidency is not about, it's not about wielding the military, that there are other things, or ideals and ideas that are supposed to be at the forefront rather than the notion of military power. And not to say that he wasn't concerned about it, but he wanted to get away from all of that. And looking to the people, forming the people, number one, defining who they are, and seeing how they're going to operate, this is something that's really, it's key for him. And it's his writing African-American people outside of it and writing other people outside of it has sort of caused, one of the things that's caused problems. Again, it's not just his fault, but his inability to see another possibility just added to the process. And so we're talking about the discontents. You mentioned today this notion of, we're still arguing about who are the people in America. And there are some people who don't think that the people who are here, everybody necessarily belongs here, or not people in the same way.
Well, if you've had occasional thoughts or misgivings about the people, though maybe we're getting over them, I don't know, that many of us had. In fact, there's a whole language about this. We talk about populism as a degenerate form of democracy, and we're afraid maybe, and this is the dirty secret that some of us are harboring, maybe the people aren't who they should be. They haven't lived up to Jefferson's expectations. But I think it's important to remember that in Jefferson's time, democracy was a dirty word.
Yeah.
And
the mob.
The mob. Who are the ordinary folk? Let's talk about it a little bit. What's wrong with democracy? Why is Jefferson, for us, it seems so natural that somebody who's just say these wonderful words on my necktie and people would rise up. Thomas Paine says, you all can listen to my common sense. This is your language I'm speaking. This is your vernacular. These are self-evident truths, Jefferson says. These are flattering things to say to the people. How do we feel about that now? Well, how do you get over that? What do you think democracy, why does democracy have those negative connotations in those days? Why would people look down on the ordinary folk? I mean, nowadays our politicians will kiss anybody's baby, or at least they used to do that. There must be,
Maybe not anymore.
I don't know, maybe there's some law against that now because, but go ahead.
No. Well, I mean, because they were afraid of what the people are going to do. Uneducated people, the mob, what might be ruled by passion, that there's a sense that reason it should be at the seat of everything, but the mob is passionate. The people don't always make the right decision. The majority doesn't always make the right decision, and there was a fear of that you could in fact have the same kind of tyranny, because he says it at one point, the tyranny of legislators could be, and that was one phase, as much as a fearing of the tyranny of one person. So there's a mistrust of the people. This notion of expertise, the notion of the elite, that really ties to a notion of aristocracy. It's sort of a fallout from that the better sorts are the people who are supposed to rule. And he says no, that you could have, he would trust at one point a farmer making a decision over a professor.
I never got that one. I'm sorry.
A common sense answer you could get. So he said, and he actually did believe in majority rule and did believe that the people had some kind of wisdom. Now, that's problematic in lots of ways. And I think that's part of the reason that people have a difficulty believing that he actually believed it. But I think he did. Yeah.
Well, he did. It was his central principle. But you mentioned that idea of the mob, and it just occurred to me, as I always indulge in wordplay, the mob is that beast. The people are a beast. It makes everybody into one kind of organism, and a very dangerous one. And it's demagogues who know how to manipulate the mob. And he thinks, I think very unfairly, that Patrick Henry is a demagogue. He admires his stirring oratory, but is fearful about what that oratory might be, might lead to in the wrong context from the wrong orator. So there's, as Annette suggests, there's a lot of anxiety about passion, about unreason, about people voting with their stomachs, about the possibility that everything could fall apart. Because what would the people do if you had a democratic government and you had a great inequality of wealth and power? What would the people, that majority that you're talking about, what would they do with their power? Well, there's a classic reference that they would make to ancient history, and they'd say they'd pass an agrarian law, which means to redistribute property. And of course, America was based on the idea of property. So the question is, how do you take people out of the mob? And the wordplay that comes to mind is mobility, moving as individuals, because all the rights talk, and Jefferson's famous for his emphasis on rights, focuses on the consenting, rights-bearing individual, taking that individual imaginatively out of the crowd, out of the mob. And that idea of being a yeoman farmer is to put that individual onto his own domain, his own property. And I think there's a clue there to what his thinking is all about. We use the word patriarch in our book, and I think that speaks to his aspirations, not just for himself as the most blessed of them, but
He called himself that. We didn't call him that.
No, there's a...
There
and
are
I
quotes
got
around
really
this.
upset because I don't know how many books you've tried to title with quotation marks in them. It's not done.
But I insisted because I did not want people thinking that this is what we called him, that we were calling this. This is how he referred to himself. Basically, he's talking about how lucky he was. That's what he really meant.
Right.
And we do talk about a patriarch and this person who is the master of his own domain. And he sort of envisions, this visionary, a place for a world where all white men would have their own domains and they would be free. The thing about not having property and working for other people or being a tenant on somebody else's land is that you are not free. Right. You are subject to their power. You cannot exercise your own sense of your own self-worth if you are beholden to other people. So the vision is not every man a king, but every man a
something
patriarch.
Like that.
Something,
yeah,
every man a king,
every
man a patriarch, and in charge of his domain.
You know, it takes that older ideas you might draw from the Anglo-American legal tradition and those rights that are codified in the Bill of Rights. Every man's home is his castle, which suggests, as Huey Long said, every man a king, every man an aristocrat in a way. What we're getting at is that Jefferson imagines a kind of leveling up. Most of his contemporaries would imagine that once you give the people any power at all, there's going to be a leveling down. It's that aspirational quality that is crucial to Jefferson, and it's why the passage of time across generations is so central to his conception of the future of the Republic.
That's why people mistrusted him, because it was very difficult. Some people mistrusted him because it was hard for them to think that that leveling up could actually happen. So you can do that with these people, with what you have here. That's not possible. It's definitely going to go down. And he had mechanisms, thinking of public education, thinking of property distribution and so forth, involving people in politics in ways that they don't want to be. I mean, when you think about the system of ward republics, the idea of different units that will allow everybody to have some participation, that requires everybody to be as serious about this stuff as he was, and to be involved in politics and to follow those things. And most people would look at that and say, no, that's not what's going to happen. People are interested, they will vote with their stomachs. They will, or not vote at all, or not participate. That's what's more likely to happen. But his optimism, which again, sometimes people said bordered on reason, led him to think that something could in fact happen, that there could be a new type of person, an enlightened person, that could come not just from the aristocratic class that he came from, but ordinary people.
Right. And there's no point in the old regime for ordinary people to be enlightened. In fact, it's not indicated at all because they might get ideas beyond their station and everything would go topsy-turvy and the world would turn upside down. I think this is a key thing, and it's a key difference between the way Jefferson thinks about democracy and the way we have come to think about democracy. It's that aspirational dimension. And as you're suggesting, Annette, there are a variety of things that Jefferson thinks will happen and are happening to the people who become known to themselves as Americans, who see themselves as citizens. For Jefferson, 1776, July 4th, the Declaration of Independence, whatever David Armitage or was it Ted Cruz says about this, it doesn't wait until 1783 at the Peace of Paris, because it's something you affirm about yourself. And that's crucial because we're talking about making a nation, not establishing a legal regime that is recognized by other regimes. And that,
So you side with Ted Cruz.
is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, no holds barred.
No holds barred, yeah.
You know, this is pent-up anger from being out on the road for years now. We've come to
But that's what he believes. It's when we started.
Goodness. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. Well, let's put on some cruise control here. And let's talk about these different things that are happening. I wanted to focus on 1776, and I know you do too, because it's that moment that stands for something. It stands for a moment of maximal and total intense engagement. It's what they call spirit, the spirit of 1776. And if you want to know what animates, that is, moves a people and makes them capable of governing themselves, it's the awareness that comes with that mobilization, with that intensity, with understanding that you have just made a decision about the future of your children and your children's children, all these people, your neighbors. Now you see each other in a different way. You see each other as part of something that depends on that engagement we're talking about. The first thing then, if we're talking about how you make a good citizen in a republic or a good Democrat, is you make him commit to something and fight to something. And the knowledge you need to have about sustaining the republic is in the very spirit that was manifest at that moment. You might say Jefferson's great anxiety is that that spirit will dissipate.
Will die, yeah.
And how do you sustain the spirit? How do you keep that alive? Because without that animating spirit, you could bring in the short guy, Madison, to say, design us a machine that will work all by itself, and you can feed any number of inferior quality human beings into that machinery, and you'll come out with a republic. Checks and balances and all this elaborate stuff.
But it has to be spirit.
But there has to be spirit.
It has to be spirit, and it fits into this notion of generations, that every generation, one of the ways you renew that is to have people think about the kind of society they want to have. A constitution that you worship and don't change, a constitution that was created for one generation that is supposed to last for a generation that is completely different, is not really fulfilling the needs of the people. You've gone off the rails. You're not, that spirit, that notion of concern about the community that you're in is gone if you just sit there and let it go forward without thinking. And he had this notion that the Constitution should be rewritten. He says 19 years, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. The idea is that you can't just let one group of people, the dead hand of the past, I can't believe I said this. He always does that.
These are the dead
hands of the past. And he's talking about the fact that he's retired and all this kind of stuff, and he wants to and I say,
Nearly dead white guy.
You have many, many years. Okay, so we've gotten that past. I can't believe I did that. All right. The idea that people from the past control people today. The earth belongs to the living, he said very famously to James Madison. And that kind of enterprise where you're actually trying to involve yourself in how you want to be governed, that is one way of renewing spirit as well.
This is the importance of the family unit. for his conception of Republican government. Because, of course, in a very small way, every family, father and mother, and especially in those days when guys mattered more than they do now, it would be the father, would have in mind provision for his children, thinking into the future. What if you moved beyond one family, but to all the families who are likely over time to share intimate connections, to breed with each other, to form new families? You might call the nation as a prospective mating pool, which is one of the reasons I think that race boundary is so critical in Jefferson's thinking, leaving aside the injustice and the experience of the captive nation suffering under the tyrannical rule of their masters. But if you think of the family, then you see a resource there that is the concern we all have for our children. Can we universalize that? And can we make it what we talk about when we talk about politics? When we talk about power, we're talking about our children and our children's children. Education certainly is important. We have a responsibility to make sure our children have that opportunity. So his bill for the diffusion of knowledge in 1779, which does not get enacted, but it's a nice idea, is when he talks about, for the first time, about rearranging the political geography of Virginia so that every ward or school district would take responsibility for educating its children. So it's not that you need to pump in a lot of high-level education to get the republic moving, but you do need to wake people up. There's that sense of wake up. See the light, as the Enlightenment would ask you to see, and do something for tomorrow or the next day, not just for your children,
but for other people's children.
Other people's children. The generation is a crucial idea for him, because it means that we imagine every generation is like an independent nation with relation to each other. It does not mean, young people, that you should eat, drink, and be merry when you come into your inheritance, because you are stewards for the generation following you. And what you need is a legal regime. Jefferson, after all, is trained as a lawyer. You need a legal regime in which the old legal mechanisms of consolidating and perpetuating wealth across generations then are reformed. That's why he's a reformer. We don't want aristocracy in that sense, because we want us to identify with each other. And that's where these aspirations will be fulfilled, because those aspirations are natural to us. They're not ones you have to learn by going to the University of Chicago and to studying the great books. It's one you know because you have established a family of your own, on land of your own. And you are, as we like to say, just as good as any other citizen. Your property is as sacred as their property. So it's these aspirations that are going to play out and be reinforced over time, as you suggested, Annette, through the elaborate structure of federalism, civic activity, education, and this may seem most paradoxical to you now, partisan activity. Because, of course, the great challenge for Jefferson and Madison in the 1790s, and we'll take a vote on this later because I assume you're all Jeffersonians, you're here voluntarily, and consent is the key term for Jefferson. If you were Hamilton's followers, he would have told you to be here. The big challenge is for us, I'll be Madison, you can be Jefferson, for us to lead the people, to help the people see what's right in front of them, to keep that spirit of 1776 alive, to make the Constitution theirs. That's what the Republican Party is supposed to do. It's not supposed to abandon the Constitution, but to make it their own. And as Annette suggests in that provocative idea, if it's the people's government, the people's Constitution, they can and should rewrite it.
And they should definitely be involved in it. And the worst thing that could happen is for the people to retreat and let others, elites, other people, take control of the machinery of government, and that is the end of liberty. I think she may be signaling
right, and
to
I
us.
think we're about to be cut off. and
Not
it's-
at all, but I think that what
Oh,
we'd like
no,
to do
no,
is
no,
open
but-
the discussion up. And what I'm going to ask is that you not ask a question until you get a microphone. I've got one and Elizabeth has one. So this is being recorded, so we need to hear the question as well.
Ooh. If it just requires a yes or no answer, we'll get more people will be
gonna pass it down here.
enfranchised.
Am I supposed to pick?
She's
really?
passing it
No,
up.
this, okay.
Wow.
I get to start. I don't know if I should stand up. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I'm a high school English teacher, and I've taught for 44 years. And I've taught Shakespeare. I couldn't stop thinking about Julius Caesar as you were talking about Jefferson being aspirational and Brutus's unfortunate blind spot when he gave Antony the opportunity to speak after him at Caesar's funeral. But given that education and child rearing is such a profound and difficult and time-consuming effort, I guess I'm just saying that, number one. And I guess my question is, does he talk about the inherent problem of democracy with elected officials being short-sighted rather than thinking in terms of the long range and spending so much time raising money to get reelected instead of busying themselves with the important job of
Well, he doesn't talk about them raising money because they didn't really do that. This is not in the,
Yeah.
that was not their time.
There is a blanket term that covers everything, though, in Jefferson's day, and that is corruption. And it may
Yeah.
seem appropriate today, I don't know. It's not my period. But the idea that this is part of his critique or criticism of his own class. He knows that the people who ruled provincial Virginia were involved in unending self-dealing.
Yep. The land offices.
They gave themselves the land. They made themselves, and they perpetuated their domination of Virginia society. It's one of the reasons he was disgusted with it. What he cherishes is the idea of somebody who would really represent the people and who would not take the moment in power as an opportunity to consolidate personal wealth and power and then to perpetuate that power and then create a new aristocracy. The great fear for Jefferson and other Republicans, we call them Democrats now, is a regression to the old regime. That's what they have nightmares about. That's why Jefferson sees a monocrat, as he calls those who favor monarchy, under every carpet. And that's why, of course, Hamilton is such a suspect character for him. So yes, as soon as representatives are detached from the people, they have an interest separate from that of the people, then that is the beginning of the end.
Hi, I'm also a teacher, a high school social studies teacher, and one thing that I try to square with my students in explaining Jefferson and the founding fathers is relating it to what would they say about today's, circumstances. And some of my questions that I have are, and I'll keep it to two really short ones, is how would Jefferson comment on some of our strict constructionists at the Supreme Court, such as the late Justice Scalia or like the Neil Gorsuch? Because I think what you were saying or what you were saying a few minutes ago was that Jefferson felt that the Constitution should be made for each generation and if it was supposed to last. And I know Justice Scalia famously said on 60 Minutes several years ago that, oh no, it's not an elastic constitution or whatever. I think I'll keep it to that question.
Okay. Well, Jefferson would have been a strict constructionist, was a strict constructionist, but what he would have wanted would have to have the Constitution redone. The people would, if you wanted to change it, you should actually go through the process of doing that. But of course, when he wanted to buy Louisiana, he bought Louisiana. And and drafted a constitutional amendment and sort of put it in a drawer just, in case. So in power, he had a different understanding about those kinds of things. As a lawyer, he was pretty formalistic about things, but he would have said he wouldn't have wanted a constitution that lasted, that was not changed, and that, that, as I said, ruled over people today from the dead hand of the past. But he certainly would have thought that you should redo the Constitution if you wanted
I think that's right. He was concerned that Hamilton and his successors, people like John Marshall, Hamilton said he was going to administer the federal government into a higher tone, more energetic. Energy was a key word. And he's the first loose constructionist. And whenever you have a document that is unchanging, by necessity to administer and govern under it, you have to construe it loosely. And that's quite right. It's important to have a document that expresses the will of the living people, and they must live by their own word. Strict construction. But as he puts it in one of his late life letters, he uses the analogy of clothes for a child are simply not going to work. As anybody who's had growing children knows, as the child gets older, you have to refashion the garment, that is the Constitution, not in an ongoing loose manner in which anybody in office can then follow her or his own instinct and say, oh, well, this is what it means or should mean.
Yeah. Well, and he certainly would have wanted judges to be doing that, the sort of judges, back to Scalia, because the thing is, Washington and the cabinet, 3 years after the Constitution is ratified, is asking people, what did that mean? What did we mean? And he was there. So this idea that people could know exactly what strict construction in that sense never really made very much sense, because it's just not, it's fairy tale to think that you can actually do that. But as we were saying, his idea was that people, if you want to fix it, but certainly not have judges interpreting, because he thought that would be, he would think that would be almost like a monarch, he was turning judges into that. Hamilton very famously says in the Federalist 78, it's the least dangerous branch, the government, the judges, because all they're going to do is just judge, and they will just reason. Of course, this is before legal realism, and people understand that, that's not just what they do. So of course, he says it doesn't really matter, but at the same time, he says he's going to administer things, which is interpretation, which could take things away from the Constitution that might not necessarily have been there.
A high school teacher. I'm sorry. I wish I were. Is there any connection between Jefferson the expansionist, the purchase of 3/4 of our country, and the leveling up of individuals? The idea that everyone could have a piece of land.
Oh yeah, that's where they were going to get the property. That's what it was for. Is for that group of people who would be Americans, the Americans who are going west, Americans who will have their own plot of land and their own independence from it.
Well, his inaugural address in 1801 is the classic text where, as you probably recall, he says there will be land enough for the thousandth to the 1000th generation. He's anticipating that the whole continent will become America. That's an important thing to keep in mind.
Maybe even Canada too, right?
Yeah, well, Canada, and then, well, he said, let's take Cuba too, and then we'll put a flag there, he says in a letter in 1809 to Jefferson, to Madison, and say no further. But that word continent is really important. It's used, as you know, to describe the Continental Army. That the aspiration in the name for those 13 pathetic little colonies along the Atlantic seaboard to imagine that they would be this great land, that word is really pregnant. And yes, it was inevitably going to be, because of the way Jefferson understood the progress of civilization, because this is a process of improvement through settlement, through farm making, taking lands from wilderness or from those who underutilize that land, the hunters and the gatherers, as he imagined Native Americans to be. So this vision, we're talking about the unattractive aspect of colonization as his solution to the problem of slavery. Well, the removal of Indians who will not be Americans is the other dimension of it. But it's all animated by a commitment to the white republic.
And they either become white, become assimilated, or, as we said, that would be the end.
Is there another high school?
No. I do have a degree in education, but I never got to use it. I would like to challenge you to a bit of a lightning round. You said that Thomas Jefferson, consent was the key, and Hamilton said, just do it.
Well,
what would
that was Nancy Reagan, I think. No, it was.
What would Adams, Madison, Monroe, and Washington's key term be?
Wow, that's tough.
Ooh.
So Madison's key term,
Oh. What do you think?
think about it.
Moderation?
Think about it. Moderation. Madison is moderation.
Yeah.
Washington.
Washington is behave yourself.
No,
That's the
true.
short version
That's
of
a
the farewell address, okay?
And who else did you say?
Monroe.
Monroe.
Well, name places after me.
Yeah, name places. Name places. Minor founder.
That was really stupid. That was not a bad question.
No, it's a very good
It's just
question.
a stupid answer.
Oh, Adams.
Oh, man, he's so uptight.
No.
Yeah, talk about neurotic. I mean, that was a friendly gesture to call you
Pay
all
attention
neurotic,
to
but
me.
He's seriously dysfunctionally neurotic. Yeah.
Pay attention to me. Very jealous
Yeah.
of Jefferson's
Yeah. Yeah.
star.
And did you have to cast Paul Giamatti?
He was not bad. He was good. He was good. No, that's a very good question. I'm going to have to use that.
One more question.
Oh, come on.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I used to be a college teacher. Anyway.
Any men out there?
There's a theme.
My question is this. In the definition of the people that
Yeah.
you started off with, there's a suggestion in a recent book by Nancy Eisenberg called White Trash, you may have run across it,
Yeah.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
the really poor white people out in the boondocks of Piedmont and so on were actually considered nearly subhuman by the founders, including Jefferson, and they were not included in the people, even though they were white. I wonder if you think she makes that case.
Yeah, it's a case. Jefferson certainly recognized that the first generation of settlers were somewhat distasteful, doing the dirty work of clearing the land and clearing the land of Indians. And there's a term of art in the period, yellow savages, that is a degradation to barbarism, becoming like the Indians, in fact, worse than the Indians. But that would characterize a class of the people over time. I recur to that word mobility. The idea that you would be permanently stuck in a kind of degraded underclass, white trash, that's certainly not Jefferson's idea.
No, I think other people may have felt that, but that was not his view, that there would be progress. And the
In the
American
West
nation,
particularly.
in the West, and the American nation, there would be progress. There would the notion of staying, as you said, stuck in this place forever, white trash forever, was not his view.
In fact, I would say that new state creation, which is something that's very important to Jefferson, Northwest Ordinance, the first version of the 1784 Ordinance, all new states will be equal. What this is a massive welfare program for needy politicians in newly settled areas who will be overrepresented in the Senate particularly. It does create a burgeoning political class in America across the continent, and it is a way of leveling up. because people then see that they have opportunity within the larger domain of the American Republic. So statehood is the threshold of union.
Yeah. And all those people could go realize they're leveling up in those places as the country expanded.
So what we desperately need are a whole bunch of new states.
Thank you so much.